Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. The Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about supporting survivors. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. So with me today, I have two amazing people. First off is Priscilla Aquino. So Priscilla uses she, her pronouns and is a bilingual victim advocate and crisis counselor at the VSC who is fluent in Spanish. She obtained her master's in social work from Kean University in New Jersey and has over 20 years of experience working with adolescents, families, and victims of crime. Priscilla is very passionate about helping people heal from their trauma and rediscover their inner strength, as well as educating others. She hopes to be the voice for those who are unable to advocate for themselves. So Priscilla, thank you for coming back onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited to have you. And I'm also very excited to introduce Orialis Sosa. So Orialis uses she, her pronouns and is a registered mental health counselor intern in the state of Florida. However, she just got her license today. She just told us right before this recording. So congratulations, Orialis. She earned her master's in clinical mental health counseling from the University of Central Florida. Orialis's background consists of providing counseling and victim advocacy support to survivors of crime and trauma. In her current role, she provides counseling support to high school students and is one of VSC's contract therapists. So Orialis, congratulations and welcome onto the podcast.
Thank you, Emilie.
I'm super excited to have this super important discussion. As a very brief introduction, we talk a lot about on this podcast about how to be great supporters to survivors in our lives. And today we are going to be talking about revictimization and its possible impacts, what to say and what not to say when someone discloses a history of trauma, how supporters can practice self-care, and how we can all better help victims and survivors as a community, as individuals, as helpers, and all that stuff. So with that, always an important question and kind of a big one to start off with. But what exactly are we talking about when we say trauma? What is trauma?
It's an interesting word because you can utilize it in so many different scenarios. But when we break it down, trauma is an experience that a person may have within their life where it affects them, emotionally, mentally. It has an impact. A lot of times people might experience that maybe through crime that they experienced, maybe a loss of somebody, maybe it was an accident, maybe, something that they have been dealing with for a long period of time. It's something that person experiences. And the trauma can be reflected in many different forms and ways. Sometimes people are in shock, or they can take it on in different forms. But overall, I would say more or less in those terms, that's what trauma may look like. I don't know, Orialis, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think usually when I talk to people about what trauma is, it Because trauma can be a different event for anyone. So I think really what's more important is the person's reaction to the situation. Essentially, trauma is, anything that exceeds a person's ability to cope. So anything that can leave a person feeling, helpless, feeling isolated. So I just think that it's really important to focus on the person's reaction as opposed to the event itself. Because again, something that may be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. Um, so yeah, just anything that can leave somebody feeling helpless, and I would also add can kind of make it difficult for people to, feel a full range of emotions. Kind of leave them feeling overwhelmed.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you both kind of bringing up the individuality that is trauma. And I love that you brought up kind of looking more at how someone reacts to it rather than the event itself, because we don't want to kind of label like, oh, that's trauma for you, or that isn't trauma, because it's different for everyone. I remember I did a podcast with a therapist who kind of had an example of a child who may have accidentally like been folded into one of those pull-out couches. For some children, that's very traumatic, right? And very scary, and they're trapped. But for another child, that might have been a really funny experience or a fun experience for them. And after she kind of explained that, I was like, yes, that's exactly a great example of what can be traumatic for some individuals may not be for others. And so just recognizing that as a supporter. And I think another, you brought up reactions and common reactions. I think there's a lot of anxiety that survivors may feel that they're not reacting correctly to trauma. So I'd like to kind of dive in. And Priscilla, you mentioned there's a lot of different ways that trauma can impact someone. So what are some of those common reactions that we see?
So when we're working with someone that might be experiencing trauma, where big question is, what are the common reactions? What am I experiencing? Because a lot of times when I'm sitting down with survivors, they will describe to me, a whole bunch of feelings and thoughts. And their big thing is, I feel like I'm going crazy. And I always tell them, you're not going crazy. These are just common reactions that you're having to trauma. So we might be looking at somebody who might be experiencing depression, sadness. Somebody might be experiencing anger. There might be going through a whole different array of emotions. Sometimes somebody might feel numb. Other times somebody might be okay, right? It's just how they're coping with with their feelings, with their thoughts. We might, find somebody that, may feel guilty, that, they might feel some self-blame, some embarrassment, with their specific victimization or situation. Those feelings might be brought on. A lot of times trauma can also affect the relationships that people may have with others. It can affect, what might be going on in those dynamics and those relationships. So, some of these people might be experiencing these feelings, and the triggers, it kind of infiltrates like the relationships, the things that they have going on, work, school, home. Is not just, specific to one area. It could be affecting their whole life in general.
Always a really good reminder of these different aspects of like social impacts, physical impacts, emotional, psychological. And then I appreciate you bringing up the fact that it can seep into other parts of people's lives too. It's not like this contained, feeling. It can kind of have ripple effects.
And it's also like we have to remember, like, who is it that we're servicing, who we're talking to, right? So if it's somebody who is a child, somebody who is in elementary school, or maybe they're in high school, right? Because trauma can affect anybody, that for them, they might affect their grades. If somebody struggling who was maybe a straight A student is all of a sudden now, having Fs or cutting classes, maybe they're having fights in school because they're not coping well with the trauma. It's the way of how they're reacting. So it really depends on who we're working with. Could be affecting their job. Maybe somebody's calling out more, or maybe not fulfilling their responsibilities. So it can definitely affect all aspects of their life in general.
Yeah, Orialis, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
No, I mean, I was just really like shaking my head at the beginning when Priscilla said how a lot of her clients, say that they feel like they're kind of going crazy, because I've definitely heard that a lot of times. I think a lot of like what we do as supporters is, normalizing, like educating, validating their experience. I know something I always tell my clients, and that I think that maybe it's a lot of like folks have heard is, you're having a normal reaction to an abnormal experience. So I tend to say that a lot to the people I work with. Um, but no, I mean, yeah, it's pervasive. It can really impact like all different levels of your life. Like Priscilla said, relationships, work, anything like that. Just kind of going through that experience and processing that itself is just so overwhelming, that to do anything on top of that can be, very draining. So yeah, I would also say a lot of times it can lead to a lot of avoidance, a lot of, numbing, because again, there's just so many emotions and so many things that can, just leave people really, really tapped out.
Definitely. I think that there's some like myths about, oh, every person who experiences trauma will be hysterical and crying or things like that. And as supporters, don't be surprised, or try not to be surprised to know that there's so many different reactions to it. It's very individual. And so if there is that numbness that you were highlighting, that doesn't mean it hasn't impacted them. That's how it is impacting them, if that makes sense. So I really appreciate you all kind of showing the diverse effects of trauma, what it can look like. But I've heard this term a lot too, revictimization. So what exactly is revictimization, and what can it look like?
I guess when I thought of it, and like Priscilla, you can add anything after, is essentially it's when survivors feel victimized, not just from the assault, but from kind of other experiences that can follow. So I was thinking of, for example, having to go through like the criminal justice system, feeling questioned, or, feeling blamed by family members, victim blaming messages that you might see in social media. So it's the after effect, and a lot of times it can really trigger a lot of those same feelings that came about from the trauma. So that's what I was thinking. I don't know if Priscilla, you have sort of a different definition.
You're hitting it right on the nail. It's definitely where, once somebody has gone through their trauma, and it's almost kind of like, having to relive it over and over again. That's what I like to tell people, when we're talking about revictimization, it's kind of like this being stuck in almost in a loop, where you're constantly being thrown into that loop. You're not able to get out of it to be able to continue with your healing process, and like Orialis said, that can look like in many different ways, working the criminal justice system, that's a big piece. When you're working with family, and the family is like, nothing happened, get over it, it's okay, move on, like not acknowledging what happened, now you're stuck on your own, with this trauma, and they don't want to accept it or acknowledge it or work with you to help you heal. Another aspect is when the systems that are put in place to help and support people, and they re-victimize, our clients, where maybe, for an example, we may have somebody who was assaulted, or maybe they're in a domestic violence situation, and they're now trying to access a shelter to go into to spend the night, right? Or they're trying to get resources from the community, and they don't qualify, they're not eligible, or there's nothing available to them. And there's, and it's like they can't seem to get out of what's happening to them. And so the same feelings that they were feeling with the trauma comes right back up again. They're, having the same reactions. So it's almost like a vicious cycle that happens to that person, that's unable for them to kind of move forward to be able to heal and process, their healing.
Yeah, I'm hearing words that are coming up to my mind as far as like must feel helpless, in that kind of situation. And, we know that sexual violence is about power and control. And so being in these systems that, we feel kind of helpless in, when they're trying to help because of a variety of different reasons, funding, there's a lot that goes into it, but I can't even imagine what it must feel like for people to feel like, reaching out for help and then either turned away, blamed for it, things like that, whether it's systems or supporters. So I wanted to ask you, why is it so important for supporters to know about re-victimization?
When somebody is trying, when I'm working with some of my clients, when they call and they're like, oh, I want to work on my trauma, I need help, I need to feel better, I want my life back. It's this journey, I call it the healing journey. And as a supporter, we want to make sure that they don't get re-victimized, because sometimes it's like when they're being caught up in that cycle, right, being re-victimized, they can't seem to move forward, they can't see the success that they've are making, right, with their progress, with their journey, and sometimes they have these huge setbacks, and depending on what the setback is, they might seem that it's too big to, I've tried doing this, they might give up, I'm gonna just stay where I'm at, this is not worth it, I'm not gonna keep moving forward. They almost give up hope, they give up on themselves. So it's kind of like just trying to make sure and understand that, we want to make sure that we don't keep them on that cycle. We don't keep them in their trauma. We don't keep reminding them that, because it's already hard enough to try to process, cope, understand the trauma that they're going through, and then to have setbacks along the way. And depending on how they're feeling at the moment, what their mental status might be, what they're capable of handling, they're fragile. And so it can really do some more damage on top of what they've already experienced.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it just hopefully can help supporters to be more understanding and to be a better support system for the survivor. Understanding that, again, they may be tapped out, they may be overwhelmed, they may be feeling, very helpless. So, understanding that having you there to kind of like guide them and walk through them is definitely a necessity. I think that a good support system is one of the most important parts of healing, one of the most helpful parts, especially because oftentimes with all the shame and blaming, survivors can feel so isolated. So, just understanding that, yeah, there's so many things that person is going through, so many like barriers that may come up, and just understanding like the value that there is in you being there for them.
Yeah, I'm actually going to jump ahead in some of our questions because that led me to this, question about, through the work that you both do with survivors, do your clients often bring up the trauma itself to process it, or do they tend to chat about how people responded to their disclosures?
I do spend a lot of time with the people that I talking about yeah, just like the family dynamics, the ways that they feel isolated, or the way that maybe they feel blamed. Yeah, the reactions that the people they cared about had. I would say I spend a majority of the time talking to them, about that.
For me, it's almost like a 50-50. I think it really depends on where the person is at, where they're at, within the trauma. And I think it depends on the support that they're receiving from those around them, right? So if the support and the reaction, or I should say lack of support, and if there was a negative reaction from family and friends, yeah, that's going to be the first thing that they're going to bring up, because I can't believe my family didn't believe me. I can't believe that my best friend or my partner didn't believe me. And and they might be just focused on that. And we might spend a lot of time on that, right? Because not only are they dealing with the trauma, but now they're also dealing that this relationship that they had with this person, and even it's a familial relationship, is now being affected, right? So it's like trying to hold on to that relationship and trying to salvage it, because some damage has been done, trust has been broken and whatnot. So I think it really depends on where the survivor is at, and what's impacting them the most. So for me, I get both. It's where they're at.
Definitely. I bring it up because I've heard from other advocates that, they do kind of talk a lot about, kind of the aftermath of it, and talking and their relationships with people and the systems that they work with. And it just kind of goes to show, like, you know, more to your point of why is it important that survivor supporters understand revictimization and what it can look like, to show that a lot of times this might be even just as impactful, or you know, it has an impact. I guess your role is really important in this person's life as a supporter. So I just wanted to kind of highlight the importance of it with that question. So I appreciate you both shedding light on it. I wanted to know if you also had some kind of case studies or specific examples, keeping in, of course, confidentiality, but of survivors experiencing exactly what we're talking about, which is revictimization.
See, let me pull a goodie out of my bag of tricks, because you know, it's an unfortunate thing to say, but I would say a good, you know, at least half of the survivors that I work with talk about and experience revictimization. I have been working on a case with a young woman who called our helpline, and she was living out of state, and she wanted to report her sexual abuse that she experienced as a child, and it was from a family member. And she knew that her statute of limitation was running out. And so I have to do this. I said, okay. We hooked up, we did the intake. I started working with her. Her story was so interesting because she had to contact 3 different law enforcement agencies here in the state of Florida, because that's where the sexual abuse occurred, right, in those 3 different counties. And sadly to say that her experience was not the best one. She did come across a lot of pushback, where she had worked with certain, law enforcement agencies that were just like, nope, sorry, you don't have enough evidence. Nope, sorry, we can't help you. I remember when one of my last sessions with her, she was waiting on a phone call from one of the agencies that the law enforcement agencies, who didn't bother to call her. And when she called and was like, hey, I didn't hear anything back from my report, what's going on? That detective was like, well, you didn't have, there was not enough evidence. I felt like there was no need to call you back. And she was like, are you kidding me? So that was one experience, but I think the one that hurt her the most was, again, one of the other, out of the 3, one law enforcement agency had told her, well, what you're describing to me is not sexual abuse. If that family member touched your leg, it wasn't the inside of your thigh, it was just on the outside. So that's just touching a thigh regularly, it's not the inside. And if they kissed you on the lips, family dynamics, there's some families that may practice that in their culture. That's just like a family dynamic thing. So this is not really sexual abuse. That's what she was told by the law enforcement agency. And that was troubling to her. And so she, it was so difficult. She knew it was going to be tough to having to report all of this, but to know that the people that she felt like they can help me, I know that I can do this, she kind of felt like defeated and felt like she couldn't move forward. But we continued to push through and try to figure out another tactic and try to challenge this, and that's what we're working on right now. But it was difficult and challenging, and that's just one experience, of a survivor that I'm working with when, in regards to that. And it was tough. It was something that she had a hard time processing. Every time when I would meet with her, she was very upset, but sometimes when I would end the session, she felt even more on fire and motivated to keep going. She kind of was like, at the end of our conversation, she felt motivated enough. And she was just like, when this is all said and done, I'm going to call every news agency. I'm going to talk about this. Like, she felt enough, like she just wanted to keep talking about her experience, to shed light. Like, it was hard enough, her personal experience, being, sexually abused as a child, and then wanting to get, support and help to when she wanted to report it. And she didn't get that. She didn't feel that. And that was very difficult and challenging for her. So she wants to share that with others because she knows that there's other people that are experiencing that.
Thank you for sharing that, Priscilla. They've done a lot of research on why survivors may not come forward and report. It's one of the most underreported crimes ever. And the biggest reason hasn't really changed over the decades of research, which is fear of not being believed or being blamed for what happened. So I know that there's amazing law enforcement agencies out there and law enforcement people who are start by believing, we work with amazing people. And at the same time, this can also still be an experience that survivors have. Orialis, I don't know if you have any case studies or examples that you wanted to bring up.
I was trying to think while Priscilla was talking. I have one. I haven't thought about this in a while, so I may have a little trouble recalling everything. But yeah, I remember a few years ago, I mostly worked with, it was a mom who was applying for victim compensation for relocation. And so the victim was actually her daughter. I believe the daughter was around 12 or so like that. And just unfortunately, with when we were applying for the relocation, unfortunately, in the way that the report was written, her application was denied because the office said that the child had consented to the act. And obviously, mom was very enraged because this is her underage child. She's scared about her safety. She didn't have the funds to move. And she was really depending on those funds to get her and her child into, a safer place away from the person. So luckily, I was working with her. So I was able to advocate on her behalf. I was able to contact the police officer and provide some education to the officer. And I ended up writing, a letter, I had to include the definition, of sexual assault for children and how, children under a certain age can't consent. So yeah, just had to educate them. And so luckily kind of going through all those processes, they did finally approve her and, she was able to get the funds. So, but yeah, that was a very difficult and just enraging experience for mom, to have to go through. And obviously, if she hadn't had someone to kind of guide her through that, she wouldn't have known how to advocate and what the laws were and everything. So, luckily we were working together.
I'm just so happy to hear that you were able to help and hear also, Priscilla, how you're supporting the survivor too as an advocate. And we're going to talk a little bit more specifically how advocates like advocates at the VSC can help survivors kind of navigate through re-victimization and process those emotions and things like that. So glad that you provided the education, because while you were saying yeah, the person was 12 and they consented to the act, I'm like, whoa, red flag. Nope, they can't consent to that at all. They're just not able to. They're children. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And kind of shifting gears just a little bit, I also wanted to uplift that those who are maybe part of the LGBTQ plus community or maybe are part of other marginalized groups may experience re-victimization. So I don't know if you had any examples, and it doesn't have to be a case study specifically, but just examples of how maybe people who, like trans survivors, for example, how they may experience kind of further discrimination, just kind of these intersectionalities kind of impacting and having this re-victimization kind of happen as well.
So I recently moved from New Jersey, and some of the work that I did in New Jersey, I worked for a hospital and was working with victims of crime as well. And I had the privilege of working with a transgendered female victim, a survivor. And I remember when I met with her and I noticed that all her paperwork from the hospital, even before I even spoke to her on the phone, what her legal name was, and it was a male name. And I thought to myself, okay, well, it says here that they might be trans, but this is the legal. So I was like, okay, called the person on the phone. And it was a very feminine voice. And I was like, okay, I introduced myself and I was calling the person by the legal name that was listed, and it was a male name. And she then corrected me and she was like, this is how you can call me. And I was like, okay, great. So when I did my intake, I met her, brought her in. She was sharing with me how people would refuse to call her by the name that she wanted to be called. And this was a person that when you looked at her, she was transitioning, beautiful long hair, was, her body was different, like she presented as a female. And the place where she worked at, even like friends and family, they would refuse to call her by the name that she had chosen. And so just at that just that in itself, and she would share with me, even after like what had happened to her, she was physically assaulted, and even then, like, just not getting that respect, and acknowledging, this is who I am, this is who I choose to be, this is how I want to be, referred as, and they would still refuse. And of course they would treat her differently and whatnot. But that was something that she had went through. So I don't know if that kind of, I don't know if you have another story, Orialis, or not, but that was one of my experiences that I had with working with somebody like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when I was working as an advocate, I can remember of one situation specifically where there was a trans survivor who was calling the line and had experienced, I believe, some misgendering and such, and just harmful experiences with the medical community. And we were able to educate them on how we had an LGBTQ advocate, and that specific advocate was able to go and meet up with them to do the exam and and everything. And as a result, they were able to feel a lot safer and, more comfortable coming in knowing that they weren't going to be, misgendered or, and that it would be, a safe space for them. So I can at least remember like one situation where that was good.
Definitely. I think that when you mentioned the word like respect and also a safe place, it's super important that, we acknowledge and validate people's authentic selves. And, survivors who have gone through so much, this can just be another trigger for them if systems or supporters are not authentically, accepting and supporting and respecting, honestly, them, right? I know that we talked a little bit about the possible effects revictimization can have on survivors. I also wanted to know, like, other things, like, are they more or less likely to reach out for help? What are some other, like, reactions or impacts that this can really have on survivors?
Many things can happen, right? I think that when some of the effects of revictimization, persons kind of stay stuck in the trauma and they never are able to move forward, and they're not able to move past it and feel like they can heal from it. A lot of times they will shut down. I sometimes have worked with survivors that I may do an intake with them, and or have maybe one session, and then all of a sudden something happened. Maybe they went to meet with law enforcement, or they had a court date, or they was working with talking with a family member, and all of a sudden I don't hear from them again. They stop coming. So they'll stop their services. They just don't show up anymore. And it's just an indication, like, all right, maybe they're not ready to continue. They need to kind of regroup. They had a step back. So sometimes, they may just stop looking for the services. They'll just stop, and they'll just stay where they're at. It's like they can't move forward. They can't move past that. And a lot of times, whatever the reactions that they're experiencing, the feelings that they're experiencing, depression, that can increase, the sadness can increase, and maybe might cause them to have maybe some suicidal thoughts. Maybe, their isolation increases, or if it's a youth that we're talking about, might prompt them to run away, so many things can happen to somebody, and sometimes now they look for other avenues to cope, because if they feel like, well, I'm trying to get the services. I'm trying to talk to my family. I'm trying to get the help. Nothing is working. They keep bringing me down. They keep increasing. Well, I'm going to take care of things on my own way. And my own way can be substance abuse. It could be self-harm. It can be, promiscuous behaviors. So all the things can then come in because what was working for them at the moment is not working for them anymore. So they're going to look for other outlets to help them to cope better.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece to it too. It really, I think they've done research, and the first person that they share with can really impact kind of how quickly they reach out for help and finding places like the VSC, and then just kind of starting that healing journey a little quicker. And beyond that too, I know that it's about 8 or 9 years after an event occurs or the incident occurs, the trauma, before a survivor actually comes forward a lot of times and tells someone about it, at least through the research that we have seen with the clients that we work with. And it just goes to show that not only, supporting the people in your life better can have that impact on their healing journey, but kind of changing the culture and the shame and the blame around it as a whole can help survivors seek that help and start that healing path a little sooner and not feel so alone if we just normalize this conversation. I wanted to also kind of shift gears to how advocates can help survivors who've experienced victimization. How do advocates kind of, we touched on a little bit about the different case studies, but how else can advocates really help survivors navigate this?
How we can help and continue is to, encourage, the survivor to continue their services, continue to talk, just keep talking. Communication is so key, being where they're at, and reminding them that they are supported, and that they're not alone, and helping them to just process those feelings, helping them to discover self-help skills, their coping skills, self-care, what works for them. Sometimes, there's a whole list. We give out a big resource packet to all our survivors that we work with. And then there's worksheets with all different types of self-care techniques. There is a worksheet that has like 99 activities that people can do, for coping strategies. It blows my mind when somebody says, well, I can't think of one. I'm like, I got a sheet that has 99 of them, So we go over that, we explore, because what might work for some person may not work. And even if you have a huge bag of skills that may normally work for you in that moment, if you are being re-victimized and you're reliving this all over again, that skill may not work for you. So it's like, all right, well, what else can work, right? So, just helping them to kind of navigate that, and being where they're at. I always like to be, client-centered. That's a technique that I like to use all the time. I want to be where they're at, what their needs are, and I go by that, and try to support them as the best as possible.
I love that. Orialis, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say I see a lot of clients who come in just very stuck, because they're not believed, or, like we said, the family, the perpetrator is still within like the family dynamics. And it's very hard for them to be able to like move forward when they know that like the people that they loved and, expected to be very supportive, that was not the case. So I feel like a lot of the ways that, I help my clients is, a lot of self-compassion, learning a lot of self-validation, even if others aren't validating your experience. And ultimately also just educating them that, people oftentimes don't believe survivors just for their own reasons. It isn't really anything to do with the survivor themselves. It's just really hard for people to wrap their minds around the fact that sometimes things happen and, it has nothing to do with what we did or didn't do. Sometimes we don't have control over everything. So a lot of times that's where the victim blaming comes from. So educating folks and a lot of self-compassion, self-validation, to help them kind of get out of that stuckness, and helping them identify like who are the people that you can really go to. Those are the voices that you should be listening to. I feel like that's a lot of what we do as well in our sessions.
What I'm hearing is kind of, meeting the survivor where they're at as far as their needs, and then discovering what helps service those needs and what helps meet those needs. And knowing who those people are. There could be people in your life that are the ones that help you get your mind off of it for the evening. So they're, doing something fun. And then there might be the friends who are really great at just listening and being there for you when you need to process a little bit. So I love that you can kind of reflect on that with the survivor to figure out what works for them. And yeah, I also didn't think of the idea that a survivor may even blame themselves for being blamed, if that makes sense, right? Like sharing their, experience, and then someone saying, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And the survivor may even be like, did I not say it right to them? Like, and kind of blaming what they even said to this person. And at the end of the day, nothing is your fault. Even how people react and respond to your disclosure is also not your fault too. So a whole nother piece to it.
Yeah, no, I could say, Emilie, that like even today I was talking with a client of mine, and we were talking about expanding the support system, right? Like when you are just focusing or not focusing, but all you have is your counselor, your therapist. And I'm like, I ain't gonna be there every day, all the time. You have to try to expand your support system, find someone you feel comfortable with to talk to, right? So one of the things that she says to me was, but I don't want to be a burden. I don't want my story to be a burden on them. I was like, well, how can we address that? What can you do to address that before you even disclose? So we were brainstorming, and one of the things that we had talked about was communicating those concerns before you even say anything. Like, hey, I have something to talk to you about. How would you feel? Would it be okay? And if I disclose this to you, is it okay if I keep talking about it with you? Because that's what I need, and it's okay to tell me, hey, not today, so we were like role playing a little bit of what that conversation may look like. But, so that's important to do that as well. Like, just to kind of just come up with them a plan. Like, all right, you may want to proceed this way. Okay. Well, what will be the backup to that? How are we going to make that happen? In case if it doesn't, what's the next step or whatnot?
I love that. I always talk about emotional kind of boundaries, checking in with the people to see, they could be going through their own thing. And, we just want to make sure that they're also in a healthy headspace and able to support that person in that moment. We'll talk a little bit about self-care too as a supporter. Last point that I always like to make, because we talked about going through the justice system and other systems that sometimes might not be what the survivor is looking for. They think, at first, I shouldn't say they think, at first, maybe they decide to go down this path, but then they may rethink it and realize that this isn't really meant for me. So can survivors still heal without going through that justice system? And then how can an advocate determine if it's right for them?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think, the justice system can be very, black and white. And so oftentimes I don't think that that's where survivors are getting their healing from. If they do choose to go that path, I mean, I remember having lots of conversations with survivors about, like, what's your ultimate why? As far as like, why are you doing this? And thinking more about like your values, right? So is this going to help you feel proud of yourself because you spoke up? Is this going to help you feel like you're, bringing light to an important cause? Is this going to help you feel more, in control over the situation? So really thinking about like those ultimate whys outside of, what the end result with the criminal justice system would be with the court case. But I mean, yeah, I think ultimately it's about, having self-compassion for ourselves, Knowing that we're not alone, learning how to manage and process our own feelings, learning how to be able to have hope for the future. I think that those are the ways that we really like find healing and move forward. And it doesn't just have to be, within the court case itself.
As an advocate, what can we do? Fact being is, we're not here to force anybody to do something that they don't want to do. The criminal justice system is there. My job is to help you to understand it. My job is to help you, get the information that you need, that you feel supported as you're navigating it, right? And a lot of times people don't go down that route because for whatever their reasons are. And many times people that choose not to go down that route will continue the healing process. I always hear the word, I want justice. I'm doing this for justice. Justice can mean many different things for many different people. I met somebody recently, a client or survivor that I'm working with, and she said, I'm not looking to report this person. What my justice looks like is just an apology for what they did. So it's what the person needs. So yes, you can heal from this trauma. You can, find, the piece of that, what you're looking for without having to navigate that. It's like what Orialis says, what is the purpose? What is the why? And, is this what's going to, help you heal? Because navigating the criminal justice, that whole piece, going down that route, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot, but it is possible. A person can definitely go down their journey of healing if they choose not to go down that route.
Yeah, and I think validating and uplifting what they can control, which is, a lot of different things. And so being that emotional support for them and that wealth of knowledge so that they go in with full information so they can make that informed decision of what works for them. Because I think there's a lot of expectations or ideas about these different, processes and stuff. And so being able to speak with advocates and reflect on what those systems and their realities really are so that they can determine, okay, yeah, this is it. And then also exploring their needs too, and really breaking it down specifically. Like, I love how you brought up the idea of justice. Well, justice is a really big word and can mean a lot of different things. So what does it mean to you? And then we can explore how we can, like, what route works best to achieve that kind of sense of closure or whatever you're looking for. Awesome. As kind of some final questions here, we talked a lot about how advocates can be better supporters, or how advocates are great supporters to survivors. But how can we as individuals, as professionals, maybe in our, professions, how can we be better supporters to survivors?
I would say, kind of a couple of tips would be, offering to go to appointments, offering to, if they do have, court or they need to do something like that, like those tangible things that you can do for them. Because again, a lot of times they may feel overwhelmed, helpless. So, they may be super on edge. And so it's hard for them to make decisions and, remember things. So anything tangible like that you can do is very helpful. I would also say things like, not really asking for too many details, kind of letting them go at their own pace, being patient with them, providing them the resources, but understanding that sometimes they may not be ready to seek out those resources. So having a lot of patience and, not respecting those boundaries as well.
Don't force people to talk if they're not ready to talk. Be respectful, when you're trying to ask questions, when you're trying to, I want to know more. The survivor's probably like, I'm not ready to talk. Be where they're at, don't force them. It's been hard enough, what they're going through. And then to kind of feel like now I'm being put on trial by my friends and family, let them know that it's okay, to let them know it's okay to express if they just want to sit and cry, let them sit and cry, let them, kind of go through their emotions in a safe space and in a safe way. That's very important. Sometimes, you want to, maybe the way you're asking the question, reframe it. Sometimes we might ask very intrusive questions, or they may come across very judgy and critical, that may shut down the survivor. They're like, I'm going to answer that. I don't have to answer that. Because that's the thing. The survivor does not have to share anything if they don't want to. I always like to tell my survivors, when you're working with me, this space, it's your space. You have the power and control here. I ain't forcing you to talk about anything. We ain't going to do anything that you don't want to do. So remember that. Let them have that power and control, because they had something taken away from them. And this is us giving them that back, and I think it's very important about that, because a lot of times, survivors feel pressured. They feel like, oh, I was forced to do this. This is not what I want to do. I'm working with a mom that she's our secondary victim, meaning where she's the mother of a primary victim. It's her daughter who was sexually assaulted. She's very adamant about getting her daughter counseling services. And like I told, the mom was very disappointed when the daughter refused. And I told the mom, I said, we cannot force her, even though she's 14, we cannot force her. She has to want this and be ready for it. I said, so what can you do to help your daughter? And and like what we came to the conclusion is helping mom. She's like, I want to help myself. I want to be in a better place. That's how I can help my daughter. I was just like, and there you go. I was just like, so that's what we're going to do. And that's how you can help your daughter. Right. But can't force people, if they're not ready, you can't force them. So just be there with them. Like I tell a lot of my survivors, you don't have to spill your guts and you don't got to spill all the details of everything. When you're asking and saying to somebody, hey, can you just sit with me? That's all I want you to do, is just sit with me. That's what I need at the moment. I don't need nothing more than that. It's okay to sit in silence. It's okay to cry. It's okay to just take it all in if that's what the person needs.
Love that. I got literal chills while you mentioned kind of this amazing idea of, I'm going to work on myself as a supporter, as a secondary survivor, so I can show up as my best self for my daughter or for my fill in the blank. And also that kind of leads me to my other question, which is, how can supporters also practice self-care? Because I think a lot of times we may focus we may focus so much on the survivor, which of course they definitely need that support and things like that. But sometimes the person may feel like they've run themselves ragged and they're not able to support that person as much as they wish they could, because they're not really taking care of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I love what Priscilla was saying about sometimes what the survivors really want is just someone to like sit there and be with them and just sort of like let them feel their feelings and not trying to change or, solve their feelings, just kind of having that presence and just like that. Yeah, that presence itself is just very like validating and connecting. So I think understanding that it's not, your responsibility to take away those feelings, just being there with the person and accepting them can be enough. I think Priscilla, or maybe it was Emilie, earlier mentioned sort of like having those boundaries when communicating. So, just having that open communication if you're tapped out that day and, you have a lot of your own stuff going on, just being open with that person. It's better to have that open communication than for it to lead into feeling resentful and feeling exhausted. So yeah, just being open about like what your needs are and what your boundaries are as well, and taking time to have your own support system because as a secondary survivor, you can sometimes have some of those similar trauma reactions as well. And so having your own person, that you can talk to. So a lot of it, I think, is like having those boundaries, for yourself too.
I think boundaries and communication so important because you as a supporter, as a secondary victim, you might be going through your own stuff, and then to take on another person, because you want to be there, you want to help and support, you love that person, but it could be a lot. So just laying out the boundary, communicating when is a good time, when it's not a good time, today's a good day, it's not a good day, or just saying, hey, this is what I can handle, I want to be there for you, but this is what, as much as I can go, right? So important. I also just want to remind people, do what feels good for you after, when you talk with that person, right? And they're sitting down and maybe you had a crying session with them and you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm feeling down and out. Just take out time for you. Do what makes you feel good at the moment. Whether if that's, I'm going to meditate for a few minutes. Maybe I need to do some deep breathing. Maybe I need to take a bubble bath and just unwind and relax. Right. Do something that always feels good for you. I always try to end all of my sessions with be kind to yourself. Right. And whatever that may look like, be kind, because sometimes we don't realize how much energy we're exerting as we're talking about these heavy things, and we don't want to sit in that for the rest of the day, right? So do something that feels good. So yeah, it's like realizing what your limits are, realizing what your boundaries are, realizing what you need to communicate, recognizing how much you can handle, right? But also remembering that you need to take care of yourself as well. And and if you are unable to identify that and you're like, I don't know what I need to do with this, share that with somebody, talk about it, don't stay quiet. Definitely share that with other people.
Definitely. I think I really appreciate you uplifting the fact that these, we talk a lot about like the healing journey, and I think that it's very pretty words, but like we kind of forget the really difficult, hard parts of it. It's takes a lot of twists and turns. There's days where, like you were mentioning, just crying or really getting into deep, heavy stuff. And I always like to kind of let people know that your healing journey is your journey and there's no wrong way, right? Of course, there's like unhealthy coping mechanisms and things like that. And like advocates and therapists can help you work through it. But I guess I just want to validate everyone's experience as they go through healing, that there's no like perfect way to heal, if that makes sense. And then as supporters, recognizing that and also knowing to take care of themselves too. And then that can look different for everyone as well, especially during these like harder days, maybe for healing. And you're always moving forward. And kind of like when you're maybe working out, for example, you need to heal after, right? You still need some time to rest too. So that self-care is just as integral as those really tough days too. If someone wants to learn a little bit more about how to be a good supporter, do you have any kind of literature or podcast or anything that they can listen to? Where can they go to learn a little bit more?
I don't have a specific resource that comes to mind. I mean, I know Minnesota, Coalition Against Sexual Assault, they have some, resources and things like that. That one comes to mind. But I would just really recommend you can contact your local rape crisis center. If you Google that, it'll usually bring up the number for your county agency, and they'll have the resources and they'll have advocates, and the resources aren't just for the survivor, but for the supporters too, who might want to get, educated and, get some tips. So that's where I would recommend starting, is your local rape crisis center.
Perfect that you say that, because I know we were using the term secondary victim, and people are probably like, what is a secondary victim? What's a primary victim, right? So primary victim is the person that experienced the trauma, right? They were victimized. They're the person that experienced it. But the secondary, it can be a family member, a close relative, a partner to that primary victim that is also being affected by the trauma, by the victimization. So even if, like, let's say the supporter, might say to themselves, well, I'm the parent of somebody that was recently assaulted or is a victim of domestic violence or of a robbery or anything like that, right? And they're like, I don't know what to do, where to go. They, like you said, they can contact a local, rape crisis center for sexual assault, but if it's, or a victims service center, If you were to call us, the Victim Service Center or Central Florida, we do take on, clients that are secondary victims. So if you're unsure and you're just kind of like, well, would I qualify? How can they help me? Just call the main office. Our main office number is 407-254-9415. And we can definitely navigate, and talk with you to see if you would qualify. And if you did, we'll be gladly to take you on and do an intake, so there's a way. And if we're not the right agency for you, we'll even help you and try to give you some community resources of other agencies that might be more appropriate.
I love that. Thank you so much for both of you for uplifting that. I think another kind of place where you can go to is that Start by Believing is a wonderful campaign about how to be just in general, start by believing when someone discloses sexual violence. And it's really about, what do I say afterwards? And they have really great resources on there as far as, if you're, a professional, like a medical professional, or maybe you're part of law enforcement and your role is a little different than just a supporter or a friend. And so I definitely recommend them just kind of Googling Start by Believing and learning a little bit more about it. And then you could just follow different on Instagram, like the National Sexual Violence Resource Center is a great one just to learn a little bit more about trauma and a little bit more about sexual violence. And then, of course, at the same time, giving yourself boundaries and space to take a break from this kind of stuff too. And just knowing, the signs of burnout, like the feelings of maybe irritability, maybe you're just feeling overwhelmed. It's okay to take a step back as well. So just wanted to uplift those. But I think that's a great place to sign up. But before I do, is there anything else you'd like to say that we may not have covered? Anything you'd like to, final thoughts or anything like that?
I was actually sharing with some of my survivors that we were doing this podcast, and they were very touched and happy because they have been re-victimized by, different systems. And they were like, please get the word out. It's hard enough, they've been victimized, they have their trauma, but when they've been re-victimized by those that they're supposed to, trust, and are supposed to receive support and love and whatnot, it's a challenge. It can set back their healing process. So, definitely start by believing where they're at. Let's be mindful that, this is not an easy journey. Trying to heal from trauma is not easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. It takes as long of a time that the victim needs. Everybody's different. Some survivors are like, well, I want to be okay in 2 weeks. It may happen, it may not happen. Let's be real here. It's gonna take time. So I say that to the supporters and to the people that are working with survivors of any kind of trauma. Let's remember that everybody's journey is different. It's not gonna look the same. And the end journey is the end purpose is all the same. We want to see them heal from this and be at peace. So, let's try to do it together, and let's uplift our survivors to get to their goal. We're all on the same path, and we want to see them be successful at their journey.
I love that. And I think that's so beautiful to sign off with. So thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, individualized, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. So to learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Orialis and Priscilla, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.